Hi, it's Chris Tiller with Restline Sotheby's Realty. Just wanted to come give a quick video introduction to conversations that I've been having recently regarding the wealth gap. As you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about the future of the wealth gap. So normally in a media type circumstance, we've been talking about the 1%. So the difference in the wealth between the top wealthiest of the wealthy and 1% and the middle class. However, from a future perspective, I think that's going to be drastically different within the next 10, 15, and 20 years, even forecasted out over 30 years. And so what is that going to be looking like? So in the future, I think this is going to be more predictive of the middle class versus the middle class. We can talk a little bit about that, but it comes down to really one main current decision, which is, are we renting a house or are we purchasing a home? These end up creating drastically different outcomes from a wealth perspective over time. Now, this isn't always the case. There's a lot of assumptions that are being made today based on the current market analysis that have changed over time to basically come up with, or for me to develop this opinion that I'm kind of thinking we're headed. This was drastically different in 2008 when interest rates, for instance, were 7%. We had interest-only loans, no money down, stated income. So some things have changed, which has kind of predicted this outcome, but we're going to kind of walk through some of these numbers. We are going to make some assumptions. So I'm going to just graph or run through these assumptions very quickly so you can see where these numbers are coming from. There's tons of websites and online calculators that you can forecast yourself and play with these. I take a very conservative approach just so that the outcome is typically much more likely, but you certainly could expand on these if you had a more realistic current market analysis, and I'll explain a little bit what those are. So some of the assumptions that I'm making and the difference in the wealth gap that we're coming between purchasing versus buying, we're going to assume a $400,000 home purchase. So regardless of where your purchase power is going to be, specifically that's what we're going to use. So if I really focus in the Southeast Valley of Gilbert and Chandler, Arizona. So this isn't out of reach, but it certainly isn't a mansion, but it is a very good entry-level first-time home buyer. You can get a decent 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. There's some arguments there based on above asking prices, but we're not going to get into that. This is just an assumption. So a $400,000 purchase. We're going to assume a 3% interest rate. That can vary up and down, again, with down payment, debt-to-income ratios, all of that, but we're going to assume 3%. That will typically march out to about a $2,000 a month mortgage payment, counting principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. With that said, we are also going to assume that if you don't purchase, you are getting somewhat of a comparable rental for about $2,000 a month. So again, we're trying to use random numbers. You could argue either way that a $400,000 house will command a bigger than $2,000 a month rent, but it's easy for these purposes. We're also going to assume a 3% rental appreciation. If you're renting in this area right now, you know that it is much higher than that. But over time, let's try to average this out as a 3% annualized rent increase. So every year when you go to renew your lease, that landlord is sending you the note. Thank you for being such a good renter. Here's your new rent payment. It's going up. We're also going to assume about $3,000 in taxes annually, which is an expense that if you will incur as a home buyer. But again, this is also a write-off, tax deductible, so it is a benefit to home buyers versus renters. We're also going to assume a market appreciation of 5%. This is where the vast majority of the wealth is created over time on a purchase because it's leveraged money. So you put down a certain amount, but you're realizing the full value of the gain of the property. If you live in, again, this is 2021, so if you live in the Gilbert Chandler area, you know that appreciation is significantly above 5%. Last year alone, we were around 13, 14% just for that area. We're tracking to be higher this year, so substantially above. If I put in here something along the lines of 7 or 8% annualized appreciation over a 10 to 15 year time frame, you wouldn't believe how big the numbers actually get. So it's difficult to comprehend if I start playing around with this number. I think historically right now we're at about 6 to 7% in the general area of about 30 years. We're going to use 5% again, just to be conservative. So those are the assumptions that we're going to use. So when we talk about the middle class versus the middle class and the future of wealth, those future wealth gap and not the 1%, because right now, the example I'm going to use is somebody sitting making middle class in an office space next to somebody else. They're doing the exact same job, making the exact same amount of money, tracking the exact same professional growth career path over the next 30 years. If those two people versus buy now or rent for the remainder, what does that wealth gap look like and create over time? So we're going to get into this and some of the reasons why it's actually worse than what some of these numbers look like, but if you were to purchase today, let's just say today, and use some of these assumptions and rent today, after 10 years, what does the wealth gap look like between those two people? So when we talk about the wealth difference, again, it's not how much cash you have in the bank, it's how much liabilities, so what you owe versus what you own, and subtracted. And what does that number look like? If you were to liquidate everything that you own, how much cash would you have left over? That's what we talk about wealth. So if you do this for 10 years using these assumptions, you are right at about $402,000 in greater wealth versus somebody who did not purchase, okay? Greater wealth, and that's immediate, trackable, and again, at a 5% interest rate. It gets obscene if we jump even just to 7 or 8%, this $402,000. So you can see a very big difference over the two people working next to each other, and when talking about wealth difference, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. So if we could jump over to 30-year, the reason why that you'll see how the number jumps so quickly is because it is a snowball. As you pay down the debt on your mortgage, it passes over how much interest you're paying. So that snowball tracks very quickly and grows exponentially over time. And again, we're going to go into why these numbers actually get worse over time. So again, over the 10-year cycle, you're at a $402,000 difference. And over a 30-year, I wish I was joking. It's $1.75 million. If this person today, these two people, one buys a house, stays in it for 30 years, and one person decides to rent for 30 years. That is the difference in the wealth between two people sitting next to each other at the exact same position over the entirety of their career. One of the major differences is after 30 years, if you have a 30-year mortgage, your house is totally 100% paid off. You don't owe anything on it anymore. The beauty of this is not is it just the wealth creation that you now have, but also the cash flow. So while this person that rented and saw a $2,000 a month rent with 3% annual increases over time still owes rent the next month and the next month and the next month. This person has now capitalized and no longer has a mortgage payment and no rent. Obviously, they still owe taxes and insurance and any HOAs, but you can see how that can very quickly change. So this is the wealth difference between two middle-class people making the same amount of money over time, over a 10 and 30-year period, just as an example, and how quickly that can change. So right now, from a media perspective, it's very easy to point at Bill Gates and say, take that guy's money. Take that person's cars and houses. They don't need 17 houses and vacation homes and planes and everything because we don't know them. They're hypothetical celebrities that we just see on social media. They get bad rap. So the difference now is it's going to be a person sitting next to you who no longer has a mortgage payment, who can retire, who can put their kids through college. So depending on the circumstance, these aren't any more hypothetical figures. They're your friends. They're the people that you work with. And so that's going to create quite the interesting struggle, you could call it, in between relationships with people, again, that live in the same exact neighborhood. One's renting versus one's buying. Now, this seems really bad, right? It's actually worse, and there's 5 reasons why. Now, there's much more, but these are the ones that I'm going to highlight today. 1, interest rates. Interest rates right now at 3%, even on the assumption over time. What that does is even if this person decides that they wanted to start purchasing later, maybe they're going to buy it 10 years, 15 years, 30 years after the fact, or even in 5 years, hypothetically speaking, we can assume that eventually interest rates will go up. If you track interest rates over time, 3% is historically basically at the bottom. I mean, it doesn't get much lower than that. And if it has, it's been in the last year or two. So as we increase over time, the amount of interest that you're paying as a debt service goes up. So how fast this number grows is decreased because the cost that you're paying to the bank for the privileges of borrowing the money goes up. So that snowball drastically slows down as far as how quick it's going to go down. Appreciation. So appreciation is the big one. This is where these numbers come from. So when you start talking about appreciation, this 5% appreciation rate, why it's actually worse is because the appreciation isn't anywhere near 5%. Like I said, last year in Gilbert Chandler, you were at 13%. Some areas were above that. Queen Creek was seeing 17% in certain neighborhoods based on growth patterns. We're expecting more in this year. So if you had bought 2-3 years ago and somebody had decided not to buy and you guys are sitting next to each other, this number may be achievable within 5 years or 3 years, depending on your purchase price. So this growth pattern is exponentially added to if we start talking about higher than normal appreciation rates. And we're certainly seeing that now above this 5%. So it can be worse for that. Inflation. Why inflation really matters is isn't necessarily because of interest rates or appreciation. Why inflation matters is because the person who's renting, who's constantly seeing an increase in their rent versus somebody who has a mortgage that stays consistent over time, they're seeing their disposable income, what they take home after expenses, food, insurance, medical, education, loans, all of that, increase over time. But they have essentially, let's say, and we're going to move into stagnant wages, but as it inflates, you start chipping away at your disposable income. Let's say you wanted to make up the difference and start to invest on your own. Maybe real estate isn't for you and you wanted to go into the stock market. But as inflation starts to impact your take-home money and flexibility from a liquidity standpoint to invest, now inflation is eating into your ability to do that. Whereas the person who has locked in their interest or their mortgage payment at $2,000 a month isn't as impacted because they're not seeing annual increases in their expense for rent, so to speak. So this inflation makes a big difference in your ability, even if you are renting, to contribute over time. It also allows for this person, again, this is just the wealth creation from a home purchase standpoint. This isn't counting the fact that they are now going to be more flexible in their income to invest more over time to 401ks, deferred comp accounts, Roth IRAs, etc. So now let's talk about stagnant wages. So stagnant wages are a big deal right now. So as things start to go from an inflation standpoint, businesses are from a marketing issue trying to acquire more talent over time. But if wages are stagnant and we're not seeing consistent increases keep up with inflation, now we're starting to see, again, a compounded effect on renters. So as their rent increases, so does their trip to the grocery store. And so they are offset by these stagnant wages where they're not making any more money, but everything that they're doing is becoming more expensive. So stagnant wages is a big one that really limits a couple of things. Immigration, another big one. This also impacts stagnant wages and inflation. So as competition into marketplaces for work increases, it creates a dynamic where businesses, again, supply and demand. If your supply of workforce is greater than what you have, then you can drop pricing on what you're going to compensate for. So again, this impacts different areas better. So for instance, Arizona, we have a ton of Californians coming here that are relocating from a high tax state. What that does is drive up appreciation. So immigration, for instance, in Arizona, is a negative impact for people that are looking to rent forever because that's where it's going to have the immigration aspect. Whereas in California, maybe the impact would be maybe why it's better, because over time maybe it could see some form of a decrease in their value as demand decreases. So all of these actually lead you to see that this is actually going to go up. The difference between somebody renting and buying, if they're able to offset some of the increases that they have incurred by buying and locking in their mortgage payment and reinvest some of those returns into other asset categories, like for instance the stock market, these numbers grow exponentially on top of that. And that's not counting the fact that we can move into appreciation. So that's my future prediction, is that these middle class individuals sitting next to each other at the same office space, going to the same bar together, whose kids play in the same soccer team, will become the new struggle. Right now it's pretty hypothetical with the 1%, like I mentioned, but it'll be really interesting how this plays out over the next 10 to 30 years and how some of these assumptions change, and if any of these reasons really get out of hand on why it's actually going to be or could be worse. So that's my prediction on the future wealth gap, and stay tuned for the next one.